Very, very welcome to this webinar about fermenting with low alcohol yeast with Gino, Maestro Gino. First, first, maybe I should excuse us. In the newsletter we sent out to you, the breweries, the link in the picture were wrong. So maybe it made some confusion for us. We're sorry for that, but obviously you're here, so you find the right way to sign up at the end. And you should always turn off your phone when you are having a webinar. Now at least you could see it's live.
True.
Yeah, and I think this is the fourth seminar we are having.
Yep.
And as usual, you're more than welcome to ask questions. Please use the chat functionality. That's the easiest. If you want to say something by voice, so to speak, just let me know via the chat, because I could turn that functionality on. But we can't have it on all the time. It will be probably a little bit messy to hear. And if you're not comfortable asking the question in English, please do it in Swedish and I'll translate it for Gino. So that's not a problem at all. Okay, I think that was all from me. The screen is your, Gino.
Okay, so let's start then. So today's webinar is on brewing low alcohol beer with one of our new yeasts, SafBrew LA01. Before we start, I always show this, but Jonas already explained, so I think we can skip this. You can ask a question if it's one that you can keep for the after the presentation. Please do, but if it's urgent, just interrupt Jonas, and he will interrupt me because I cannot hear you in this platform. And then I will answer your question. So just a quick, I do this in every webinar. I'm sorry, because sometimes we have new people joining. So we are Fermentis, and we are part of the SafBrew group, which is quite a big company with the headquarters in Lille, which is, I will take my pointer, which is here in France, just on the border with Belgium. Lille is a beautiful city, so if you ever are in the neighborhood, please visit and enjoy all the beer diversity they have to offer over there. It's quite. Our yeasts are produced in Ghent, which is only about half an hour drive from Lille. In this beautiful factory, the ones that were in the webinar last week could see more pictures of that. I will not go into detail on this anymore today. We are quite close, actually, to Sweden. You are in this beautiful country, and we are here. So if you fly, it's about 1.5 hours. So we are quite close. Unfortunately, we cannot do that at the moment. We plan to do like a Fermentis Academy officially in Sweden, but most likely it will not happen anymore in 2020 because of the Corona situation. So that's why we came up, obviously, with these webinars. So now let's start. So Fermentis works in the world of fermented beverages. We have all kinds of products, mainly yeast for beer, for wine, cider, spirits, and also potable alcohol. Today I will focus obviously on a single yeast. But before I do that, let's talk about yeast. So what is yeast? Yeast is a sexual organism. It's quite small, 4 to 8 micrometers, and it belongs to the fungus, fungal clade, if you look at the tree of life. And I just thought, just to show you how this such a tree of life looks like. I think most of you have seen this, as a student or even before. So you have three main domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. And we as humans belong to the animal clade, of course. And actually, we are quite close to fungi, as you can see. So we are not that different. And also quite close even to plants. And if you ever are in Belgium and you go to the zoo in Antwerp, they have these little signs at each animal that state how much genetically different you are from whatever you are looking at. And then if you look at monkeys, it's quite close. The genetic difference between a human and a monkey is I don't know, around 95%. Similar genes. If you look at plants, for instance, we share about 30% of common genes, even with bananas. So it's quite interesting, this kind of classification, and you'll see later why I'm telling all this. So if we only look at the fungi, and specifically only yeast, you can also make, of course, a classification on the yeast. So I will skip this. But before I can do that, I have to explain a little bit on how such classification works. So here you see a very simple phylogenetic tree, or a tree of life, that consists of different organisms or groups, A, B, C, D, and E. And they have always they could have a common ancestor. So the most recent one is the one that is here, and you can go on and on. And the length of these lines says something about the evolutionary history of a certain species. So, and if they are related, they always cluster together. So they share, these two share this branch. I hope that is clear. So now let's look at more details. So yeast diversity. If you look at yeast diversity, it looks a bit like this. Obviously, the tree is much larger because there are around 200,000 species in nature. I think now maybe 50, 60,000 species have been identified already. So these trees you can make for all these species. What is relevant for us as brewers is where are our interesting strains. So the ones that are interesting, for instance, are the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which you use for making beer, the Pastorianus or the Baianus, which you use for wine, and the Pastorianus you use for lager. And you see they are all quite related. They are quite close together. If you compare it, for instance, to another yeast like Saccharomyces pombe or Thalassospora albrucki, or you can see it here. So where is this going? This is a classification by the University of Leuven, by the group of Verstrepen. And before I joined Fermentis, I was in this group. And what we did back then is we basically sampled yeast from all kinds of substrates, all kinds of words from all over the world. And we basically did a full genome sequencing on them to see how genetic related they are. And the outcome of the study was that actually you could basically domesticate yeast to a certain region. So to give you an idea, here you see the Asia clade. So all these yeasts were isolated from Asia, and they are also really genetically quite comparable. You have yeast from Britain, from the US, from Belgium, etc. And then in addition, they also checked, okay, where are these yeasts being used for? So some yeasts are used for beer, others have, diverse use, some are used for wine. And you can see that all these yeasts cluster quite nicely together. So you have two beer clades, a wine clade, a mixed clade, which also includes bread yeast, and also a clade like the Asian clade that involves sake yeast. So this is quite interesting because you can see based on the origin of the yeast that it evolved in a certain region, in a certain country into different yeast, but they are still quite genetically related. Another study, a very similar one that was done, found exactly the same. So this is quite interesting. They also find that some yeasts are only occurring in the Philippines, other ones are only occurring in that region, and they all genetically very close together. So if if you take all these yeasts and then look at the fermentation power of some of these species, you can see, and this is shown in this table, you can see that some yeasts are very poor in producing alcohol. Some are listed here. Some are moderate, some are quite good, and some are very good. And the ones that are very good are the yeast that we use for brewing, and winemaking. Saccharomyces baianus for wine, Cerevisia for beer, Pasteurization also for beer, and others are a little bit less. So if you want to brew low alcohol beer, you probably don't want to find it in this clade of organisms because they all produce high alcohol. I see in the chat that the sound disappeared. This is true?
Yeah, for some, but several are reporting that they have sound. So it probably must be some local issue if there's the connection or some cord. So for me, the sound's really good. So yeah, more and more people reports no problem. So please check your connection, or the computer. Yeah, more and more reporting that's okay. So
all right, then I'll just continue.
Yeah.
You can always listen back because we are recording this webinar.
Yeah.
So to bring it down to the classic brewing yeast, I've shown this before. You have the Saccharomyces pastorianus, which is bottom fermenting. It likes more cold temperatures, but it's also slow. And then you have the ale, Saccharomyces cerevisia, which is top fermenting and which likes a warm environment and is a lot faster. So at Fermentis, we have 14 different yeasts now in collection, 3 lagers, 11 ales, and 2 special ones, SafBrew LE01 and SafBrew HA18. And today I will focus on the LE01, obviously. So if you look on the similar phylogenetic tree, as I just explained, for all this wide variety, where are our yeast clustered, and where, if we develop a new yeast, in what clade we still need new kinds of yeast, because that, if you start with the yeast from a different clade, you also get different flavor profiles in general. It's not always the case, but it's a good starting point at least. So if you look at the yeast we have now, it's a nice diversity, a nice spread, I would say, over the phylogenetic tree. So what all these have in common is, of course, the alcoholic fermentation. Just quickly, you convert glucose into CO2 and ethanol, and this is molecularly imbalanced, so also by weight. So if you start from 180 grams of glucose, you produce around 92 grams of ethanol and 88 grams of CO2. So if you measure the weight loss in your fermentation, you also know how much ethanol has been produced. This is theory, of course. In practice, always a small part of your glucose goes into biomass to grow yeast, which is on average around 5%. So if we look a little bit more closely to what happens is you start from the malt, of course, you do your mashing, and you end up with fermentable sugars, 10 to 15% glucose, 50 to 6% maltose, and then the higher sugars. Those you ferment and you produce ethanol and CO2. Also quite a nice amount of glycerol, some acids and biomass, and obviously also some residual sugars like dextrins, maltotriose, the ones that are not used by all yeasts. Metabolically, of course, and for us as brewers, the flavor profile is and the aromatics that are being produced are more interesting because we know that ethanol is being produced and CO2, so it's more the small details that basically set you apart from other brewers, from other beers. And that looks like this. I discussed this already a few times. So you start from sugar, you go through glycolysis, and you make ethanol in fermentation mode, but also, very favorable flavors like isoamyl acetate, ethyl acetate. Those two are produced by all yeasts, and no matter what yeast you use, but in different amounts, obviously. So this is the typical banana fruity, and this is the typical solventy flavor, the flavor that you pick up if you drink a nice Trappist or a triple. And those two are very dominant. If you are more into Belgian blonde beers, the classic ones, you also pick up this compound 4VG. It's the spicy note. You can also find it in typical wheat beers or in saison style beers. So in depending on the beer style that you brew, some flavors are desired, others are not. And obviously you have typical undesired off flavors like the sulfur flavors, diacetyl, the buttery notes. Although in some beers it's still, some of it is acceptable. In general, it's not. So if you want to have more info, I'm just showing this once more. We have this nice tips and tricks book that you can download for free from our website, which basically has a lot of information, baseline information about our yeasts, how fruity they are, how spicy they are. And you should look at it as a starting point if you select a yeast for a certain beer style. Because as I showed a few webinars ago, if you change fermentation condition, also the flavor profile of your beer changes. I'm going to SafBrew Alice01, and don't worry. Quality of our yeast, we discussed this last week. Just to show you quickly the ales, it's very good. The viable yeast count is 10 to the 10th cells per gram, which is quite high. Very low contaminations of lacto acid bacteria, acetic acid bacteria, pediococcus, etc. So about less than 1 LEB, so it's actually below the detection level for 10 million viable yeast cells. So the purity that we have is 99.999%. Why it's not 100%? Because in our production process, in the final scale up of the biggest production fermenter, we cannot add sterile air, so we add deep filtered air. So there's always a possibility that something that's floating around in the air goes into your propagator. But if we check the analysis, the amounts are very low. So at present, we have the best purity on the market in active dry yeast. So what about the non-alcoholic beer market or the low alcoholic beer market? I just checked. This is quite recent on how it is doing. Around 4 years ago, it was already, the projected growth was already 4% or something, and now it's even it's growing even faster. A lot of people are getting more, I would say, educated. A lot of people realize that alcohol is actually not that healthy, so they try to lower their consumption, and that's why you see that in all the health wave that is occurring, you see the growth of this alcohol-free market. So for you as brewers, it's important that you also start brewing low alcohol beer, because otherwise you miss the boat. So let's go to SafBrew LA01. As I mentioned, it's a new yeast strain. At Le Saffre, we have a yeast cell bank of around 8,000 yeasts now in collection. And when we are looking for a new yeast, first, obviously, we look in our own collection. And a yeast that we found was actually back then called Saccharomyces chevalieri. It has been reclassified, I think, 2 years ago. There's a global agency that classifies and reclassifies organisms all the time. So now the official classification is a Saccharomyces cerevisiae var. Chevalieri. So the variant is called Chevalieri. So the main characteristics of this yeast are that it's a maltose negative strain, so it does not ferment maltose. So if you think back on the slide I just shown on the composition, typical composition of the wort, you have 10 to 15% of glucose. That's the only fermentable sugar for this strain. It produces some aromatic compounds and it produces a little bit of phenolics, but very low. And I will obviously show you how this development went. If you look back to the phylogenetic tree of our yeast again, where do we find the LA01? We find it actually in this clade, which is a typical spirit or sake clade. It's quite interesting because you don't see it here, but here it's the position is SafBrew HA18, which is actually a yeast that is perfect for brewing very high alcoholic beers like barley wine, and you can go up to 18%. And this one is very good for brewing very low alcohol beers. So this shows that, even with the same or a very similar shared genomic background, because they are quite close together, they at least cluster in the same clade, you have two yeasts that are behaving very differently and do different things. So let's continue. What we did before we started, obviously, because we didn't came up with SafBrew LA01 immediately, we first compared it, of course, to other typically known yeasts that are basically lousy alcohol producers. So the ones that are fermenting but not too high alcohol. So we looked at Pigia, we looked at Saccharomyces ludwigi, we looked at Torraspura delbrueckii, and we looked at Zygosaccharomyces ruxi. We all did fermentations with these in comparison, of course, to the SafBrew LA01. What we did is we used a 100% Pilsner malt from a Weyermann, a normal mash diagram, 65 degrees for 15 minutes, 73 for 10 minutes. We used mosaic hop pellets in this case for bittering. And we diluted the 12 Platos back to 8 Plato and 16 IBU to reach a target of around 0.5 ABV. That's what we thought. Temperature of all the fermentations was 22 degrees, and in later experiments we also compared it to what happens at lower temperature. So let's check these first results. On the y-axis you have the percentage of ABV. On the x-axis you have the different organisms. So bottom line is they are all what they are expected to do, so they are not producing a lot of ethanol. But still, if you look at the fermentation, we saw that the first two, so the Torraspora and the Ludwigi, are extremely slow yeasts, and in addition they are maltose positive. So if you wait long enough, they might start fermenting maltose. The Pigia and the Rucci, we saw that they don't consume all the simple sugars, so they could produce sweet beers, which is a disadvantage. And then we have the SAF LA01, that stopped fermenting after the consumption of simple sugars. So it has some less risk of over attenuation compared to these two. So obviously we also did sensory analysis, and I will not go into the full details. I'll just summarize the results. So we saw that the Del Brookie was quite neutral, but very malty and worty. So quite a lot of wort flavors. Obviously because it doesn't make or doesn't produce a lot of aroma itself. The Ludwigi, quite nice, balanced fruity beer with a little bit of DMS. So it came out quite nice. The Rushi was full of off flavors. So, you know, that was skipped immediately. And then the Pigia was extremely fruity. It had such a high isoamyl acetate level, at least to our opinion, that it was actually undrinkable. Because if you have too much, you can imagine if you have too much banana in your beer, it's out of balance. And then the LA01, it was also nice, gentle, fruity, but with a slight phenolic note. But it had no defects like you know, high off flavors, high DMS, etc. So we continued based on these results with the LA01, of course. Has to go. Because before you enter the market, you do a lot of these kinds of studies. So then we did a lot of shake flask tests where we pitched 50 gram per hectoliter of yeast in 15 platos, and then we diluted it down, and we did all these fermentations at 20 degrees. So let me show you what came out. So the first, I'm going to show fermentation kinetics. So here you have the alcohol production over time at different wort gravities. So 15 Plato, 10 Plato, 8 Plato, 6 Plato. So the 15 Plato was just diluted down. And as you can see, you know, you reach, you know, the final attenuation, final ethanol concentration at around 70 hours. Maybe the 15 Plato takes a bit longer, 80 hours, but in general, around 60 to 70 hours, and then you're done with your fermentation. Apparent degree of fermentation is around 13 to 14%, obviously depending a little bit on the gravity, but not that much. Sugar consumption. So here you have the sugars on the y-axis in gram per liter, and here you have the different conditions. So if you look at the initial wort, you have some fructose, you have some glucose, you have a big pile. Yes? So you see of maltose, which you also expect, and you have some maltotriose. And then at the 15 Plato wort, you see there's still a little bit of glucose left. The fructose is completely gone. The amount of maltose is exactly the same as in the wort, so it's not fermenting maltose. And also the maltotriose level is the same. And then if you dilute back and compensate for this dilution, you find exactly the same. So the simple sugars DP1 are totally consumed, and the higher sugars, DP2 is like 2 sugar units, so is maltose, and maltotriose are not fermented at all. Produced ethanol in the different conditions. So at 15 Plato, we produced around 1.15% of ethanol. At 10 Plato, we produced around 0.75. At 8 Platos, around 0.55. And at 6 Plato wort, we produced 0.4% of ethanol. So this already shows this yeast is very shit in producing alcohol, actually. So very good if you want to make low alcohol beer. if you use all the data and try to find some correlation, actually you find actually a linear correlation between the amount of alcohol that you want and the original gravity. And you see that in this graph where you have the ethanol and the original gravity of the wort. It's a linear correlation. So if you want to produce a low alcohol beer, which is in France and Belgium, it's 0.5%. I don't know in Sweden. What is low alcohol beer in Sweden, Jonas?
We have what we call lättöl, that's below 2.25, and non-alcoholic, we used to say it's below 0.5.
Okay. So that you can basically then brew beer in this last category.
Yeah.
Aromatic compounds. I'm just going to make my screen a bit. ppms on the y-axis, and these are the different conditions. Obviously, in the initial wort, you don't have a lot of flavor, but still we measured a little bit. Then at 15, Plato, 10, 8, and 6. So the majority of the flavors are isoamyl alcohol, acetaldehyde, a little bit of isobutanol. If you look at the actual threshold, so the flavor threshold, how well you can taste this, and this is a bit, it's based on population studies. So if you can be an extremely good taster and taste specific flavors, but so this is general above or below threshold. So acetaldehyde was a bit above threshold, so this is like a apple flavor. But not much. Isoamyl alcohol below threshold, isobutanol below threshold, diacetyl obviously also below threshold. So it's there's a little bit of fruitiness, but not that much. Yep. Then we looked at temperature. What happens if you brew at low or if you brew at high temperature? Because what brewers have been doing before this yeast was there, they were already brewing lower alcohol beers also with yeast, but just slowing down fermentation to see what happens. And we also see that you can slow down the fermentation and end up with a little bit lower ABV level, but the risk you have in this case is that not all sugars have been consumed. So because this it's possible because you are at this lower level, so you can have some stability issues in your beer. Aroma wise, we found no differences, so 22 or 10 degrees was very, very similar. So first conclusions, you can produce a well-balanced beer. You ferment preferably above 10 degrees. Obviously, the beer contains a lot of residual sugars, including maltose. So the beer is quite fragile in regard to contamination, which can be dangerous for the beer stability. And that's why we say pasteurization is mandatory to stabilize the beer. That is also the reason, because I saw a question coming in, why it's not released in a homebrew sachet. Because most of the homebrewers, and I'm one of them, guys, have no pasteurization equipment at home. What we can do is we can put it in some hot water, but before you reach pasteurization temperature, your beer is already, damaged so hard that it becomes maybe not even drinkable. So just a quick on the pasteurization. What is pasteurization? It's described as normally as pasteurization unit. So if you have one pasteurization unit, your beer has been for 1 minute at 60 degrees equivalent. You can put that in a formula, which is shown here. And you have two types of pasteurization, tunnel and flash. We prefer for this yeast tunnel, but I will show you why. Because what we did, if you look at the pasteurization recommendation, because before we launched this yeast, we had to know. We first looked at, of course, the EBC good practice guidelines. So for low alcohol beer, they state 14 to 60 pasteurization units. For no alcohol beer, 80 to 120 pasteurization units. So that's why we stated in our first recommendation, 100 pasteurization units are required, and always pasteurize after packaging. So use a tunnel pasteur. The reason I'm saying that is because obviously we did a trial. So what we did is we did a fermentation with the L01 at 25 degrees. And then we cross-contaminated it ourselves with T58. T58 is a yeast that is perfect for blonde-style Belgian beers. It has a slight spicy note, but it's a very nice banana fruity. You can make a very nice beer. It's one of my favorites, actually. And the reason why we selected this is because T58 always works. You know, no matter what wort you put it in, it always works. So it's a very robust yeast. If this grows, it's a very good, basically theoretical contaminant, because it always works. So we cross-contaminated the fermentation with, of course, with nothing to compare, with 10 to the third cells of T58 per milliliter, 10 to the fourth, and 10 to the fifth. And then we pasteurized and checked, of course, the level of contamination. We also looked at different pasteurization levels, so 25, 50, 75, and 100. And we did that by plating on YPD media to see, okay, do we have any yeast growth left? And the results are shown here. So here you see the cell count, and here you see the different experiments. So in the first one, and I'm showing here two situations, so 25 pasteurization units and 50 pasteurization units. So if you see a bar, there was yeast present. So obviously, if you don't contaminate, you don't find any yeast after pasteurization. If you contaminate the L01 with a small amount of T58 and you pasteurize at 25 PU, you find growth. And of course, if you increase, you find more growth. I don't know why this bar is so high, but that's what they found. At 50 pasteurization units, as you can see, we didn't find any viable living yeast back. So now we say, okay, if you are at 15 pasteurization units, you are safe, and you need at least this amount of pasteurization to stabilize your beer. If you don't, you might end up with problems, because the slightest contamination of the beer will result in, of course, the continuation of the fermentation. Bear in mind that almost all organisms in the world can grow on maltose. It's a very nice sugar. So any fungi, most of the yeasts, bacteria, they all consume maltose. So it's very important to use pasteurization. So final conclusions for this yeast. We recommend the pitching between 15 to 80 gram per hectoliter. We didn't do a complete study yet to check the impact of pitching rate on flavor profile. That might come in the future. We are still working on our current range. Ideal fermentation temperature between 15 and 25. We only have an apparent degree of fermentation of 15%. With 7-8 platers, should produce around 0.5 ABV, and the pH will be around 4.5. If you start your wort pH at around 5.2, we observed no off flavors. Obviously, as I just showed, you need pasteurization. You cannot use it to repitch, and you cannot use it for re-fermentation, obviously. Why can't you repitch? Because as I showed before, the purity of our yeast is 99.999%. Which means, if you don't pasteurize and let it stand for a long, long time, in the end, it's possible that some contaminant will take over the fermentation. So if you repitch, crop and repitch and reuse all the time, you might enhance or basically select for the guys that like the maltose, because there's a lot of maltose in the words. And with that, I came to the end. If you want to know more about this yeast, you can find it obviously also on our website. If you click, follow this link, or just you create beer. So if you go to Fermentation Solutions, you'll brew for brewers, and you end up with the description and the technical data sheet automatically. So this brings me to the end of this webinar. We already did 4. We still have some left, so I will discuss with Jonas which ones to do next. If you have your own idea, or if you want to have a specific subject, please complete this 2-minute questionnaire and leave your comments behind. I will take those and work on a specific presentation. From the first webinar, for instance, I got a question about counter pressure fermentation. I'm preparing this now, so in one of the later webinars, I will talk about counter pressure fermentation, because a lot of you guys had questions about that. If you have any questions, please shoot. So Michael had one question about the Ali01 for the homebrew market. I think it's clear now why we don't. If you are a homebrewer and you want to try it, you get hold of some of Ali01 from a craft brewer. Make sure if you brew that you pasteurize. We did it in experiments actually, where we did some small brews, and we just put the bottles in water for an hour or so, and that kind of worked, but obviously there is some risk involved.
Now I have a question. Have you made any measurements on how much of the contamination you have after the fermentation with the usage of oxygen for aeration?
Not that I'm aware of, but I don't understand really the question, because if you oxygenate the wort, it will not enhance the contamination level. It's as I showed, we have less than 1 bacteria per 10 million yeast cells, so the yeast will always dominate the fermentation. That's no problem. It's in our case, I explained this in a previous webinar. Wort aeration is something you could do, but if you use dry yeast, it's not required actually. It's up to you if you want to use aeration or not. The only reason why you aerate, I think most of you guys know, it's a historical heritage. Back in the days when there was no dry yeast, all the brewers were cropping the yeast and repitching it, and were continuously growing the yeast actually in their brewery. And the biggers are still doing similar things. And then they saw at a certain point in time, the fermentation performance was going down. And the reason is that only if you have oxygen present, typical compounds like sterols or polyunsaturated fatty acids can be produced by the yeast. So already a long time ago, brewers found out that if you oxygenate the wort, you can revive your yeast. And that's simply because some typical compounds that the yeast needs for growth are only produced in aerobic mode. In dry yeast, all these compounds are already in the package, so you don't need to do that. But what we saw, and I saw that, for instance, in the wine, in the wine fermentations that we did, is that there also in the wine they also aerate the wort, and we saw in some cases, not all, sometimes you end up with a little bit lower gravity, like 0.2 or 0.3 Plato, if you had aerated the wort and compared it to unaerated wort. But this was for wine. For beer, we did not do any studies on that, because we know that the flavor profile stays the same, and we know it works if you pitch directly with dry yeast. So, does that answer your question, Vlado?
I haven't come up with any new question. Yeah, it comes somewhere. Have you made any measurement? Oh, sorry. Okay, the biggest problem with other yeast strains, Ludwig, for example, from other producer, is contamination even during the fermentation. Is that why the time for fermentation is short? And is it required to make the pasteurizations immediately? Yes, the old questions are probably was the answer on the question.
Yes, and it's important to do that, to pasteurize immediately. The level you can find a little bit yourself. We recommend 50, but you know, if it was, I already have brewers that did it at 40. So it's not, it's a recommendation that we do. But you have to play a little bit yourself, because there's so many conditions involved. Your system, you have, you know, very economic, very efficient breweries and fermenters and pasteurizers, and you have less good ones. So it's, you have to find out a little bit yourself. Then we have a question from Svante.
Yep.
LA01 isn't for homebrewers. What's the next best yeast for low alcohol beer? Well, all the other yeasts that we have could in theory be used. I have great results from a brewery in the UK that has been using SafAle SO4 for low alcohol beer. And they actually also won a prize with SO4, with the low alcohol beer. They just, what they do is they make a very low gravity wort and ferment, you know, up to a level of, they did 0.45% or something. And to prevent it, you know, because if you have a very low alcohol beer, it always tastes a bit watery, you know, and sweet. So what they did is they came up with a very interesting dosing scheme of a variety of hops. I think they used 10 different hops in a very, you know, determined specific dosing scheme. So I think they did 4 different dry hops at 4 different times with different varieties, and even during the boil they use a specific scheme. So it's and they came up with a very nice, elegant tasting low alcohol beer. And to be honest, it will never be a real beer. And there's no low alcohol beer that can, you know, be as good as a real beer. But you know, if you look now what's out there, it's becoming better and better, especially the ones that have, you know, the special type of low alcohol beer. So the low alcohol IPAs, the low alcohol blondes, they all taste quite nice actually. You know, if you can't drink beer, if you have to drive, for instance, it could be an ideal situation.
Isn't it also an idea, if you want to do a low alcohol beer, is to
you also have a lot of sweetness then. So in general, I would say try to reduce the use of malt as much as possible. You cannot reduce it completely, obviously, but that already helps in you know, in reducing the sweetness.
I had a question where to find the LA01. I have
So you cannot call the beer for lager or ale. What is it if we use LA01? LA01 is an ale because it's a Saccharomyces cerevisiae and the variant is Chevalieri. Is it possible to dry hop the beer? Yes, please do, Vlado, because you need a lot of hops to get a beer-like taste. If you, I think a lot of you guys have tried lagers. You know, the low or zero alcohol lagers. Most of them are undrinkable. They are too sweet, too worty, because they miss the whole beer character. Normally that's solved by alcohol, but for special beers, it's a different cookie. If you can, if you heavy dry hop your beer, you already get a beer sensation. You were thinking about this because of the pasteurization, which has to take place immediately after the fermentation. Yes, but you can dry hop also in the warm condition. So what you do is, it's what I do, but obviously, so I normally start dry hopping already at the end of fermentation, and then at the end of fermentation, I cold crash. So you already bring it down to a lower temperature. I use a lot 14 degrees for a few days and then go down to 4. And the hop is still in there. And then during maturation, you are still dry hopping. So, you can do dry hopping up to, I don't know how long. Normally, I do it for around 7 days. I also did it longer, but I don't know. I never tasted any, taste benefits if you do it very long. So, how long is maturation? Maturation is, if you talk to classic brewers, they say the longer the better. Um, in many cases, is true. Uh, Normally, if you brewed and you're done and you cold crash, I would leave it in at least at low temperature, so at around 4 degrees for at least 2-3 weeks. Because even though the yeast is in a very low mode of very low state of energy, so it's not doing much, you clean up so much your beer if you let it mature for a long time. So it's always beneficial. Obviously, you have to choose for yourself how patient you are. If you want to start drinking the beer, uh, you can choose for a lower maturation time.
I have to ask, Gino, how much time did your marketing department spend on coming up with the name Low Alcohol One?
Not that long, actually. Yeah. Maybe a lot of you brewers wonder why we have this classification with numbers. Why all our yeast have a number, and it's basically history. So when fermenters started, the first one I think was WB06. It's the yeast for to produce Belgian style wit beer or German style wheat beers, and the name of this yeast was WBO6 in the yeast bank. So they just continued building the names like that. Sometimes it's logical, like the LA01 it's the first yeast that comes from the collection that is used for low alcohol beer. But if you take another one, BE256, I don't have a clue actually. B is for Belgium, 256. It could be vial 256 in our yeast bank. S33, I don't know where the S stands for. 33 is probably vial number 33 originally in the yeast bank. It sometimes is a bit unclear, but the reason that we don't rebrand the yeast to a specific beer style is because we strongly believe that with a single yeast you can produce many different beer styles. So if you limit yourself by saying, okay, this yeast is our New England yeast, or this yeast is our typical British ale yeast, then you basically limit the brewer and all the brewers by, okay, if I want to make an ale style, I will select this yeast. And that's not our philosophy. We believe that if you take, for instance, T58, you can make a beautiful blonde beer with it, but also a triple and also a porter if you like. So there's much more obviously going on in your beer than only the yeast. To my opinion, yeast is one of the most important aspects. But as a brewer myself, I don't underestimate the impact of a nice malt bill, because especially what I just said, if you brew a porter without a proper malt bill, you will never brew a nice porter. So that's why we have this strange naming of our yeasts.
Okay, I think. Is it possible to reuse the yeast up to 3 times with high cleaning / desiccation routines?
I would not recommend that because at the slightest contamination, you will ruin your whole batch of wort. It's a lot cheaper just to not reuse. I would say it's a lot safer. Our other yeasts, on the other hand, our normal yeast, you can reuse if you like it. We did some work on that, and even in anaerobic mode, in fermentation mode, it works quite well 3 to 5 times, a little bit depending on the yeast. And then you have to start, the performance will go down. Then you have to start aerating or repitch with a new fresh yeast, of course, with a new yeast pack. A different question.
Yeah.
You have, I can read it also, Jonas.
Yes.
Do you have a yeast for making a spirit, 5% or even lower alcohol, made of water and fruit syrup? Is this possible? Have to scan all of alternative channels these days. Actually, we have a brand new product.
Sounds like hard seltzer, doesn't it?
Yes, it sounds like hard seltzer indeed. We have a new product specifically for hard seltzer. It's called Springfirm NAB3. It's actually a mix of compounds that you use in combination with the yeast. So if you only want to make 5% sugar, make sure 5% alcohol, make sure to use exactly the amount of glucose that is required for that. And then you can use a variety of yeast in combination with NAB3 to produce this hard seltzer styles. Maybe I could do a webinar on that later on, because also this style is growing extremely fast. It's growing even faster than low alcohol beer, actually. So these lemonade, in Sweden it's a bit different, but here you can just look in the supermarket and see what's new, and you have all these, the shells of hard seltzers are getting bigger because a lot of new producers are making these, and it's quite nice. If it's the weather is nice. It's a lot of women like these drinks. So if you have a tap room with beer, this is something that could also attract the women in your tap room.
Yeah, and we have recently added it to our assortment, so you can find it on our webpage now. We say thanks to Michael.
Yes, thanks.
Kalle wanted the name of
the
product.
Type it. Wait, let me just quickly go and see if I can find it on if I have it. If I have the web page, let me just quickly find it. I'm not sure if it's already online, actually. So I'm now on another screen. Let me check. So I cannot find it that quickly, but the product I will just type it. No, let's go back to it.
I'm looking where to find
Yes, sorry, I was clicking. It's called Spring Firm NAB3. And I will, at Humlegarden, they have the specification sheet and all relevant information. As mentioned, you have to use this in combination with a yeast. So depending a little bit on the flavor profile that you want, you can choose. A lot of people have been using it with soft spirit HD1. You can go up to 18% ABV. And then if you want to go, if you want only a 5%, you can dilute back, obviously, if you want. Now that we are mentioning new products, what also could be interesting for you, because soon we will be harvesting a lot of apples in Europe, also in Sweden. We have 4 new cider yeasts that are available now, with 4 very different flavor profiles. So if you want to try something new and make ciders, this is your chance to be exceptional. I started doing these myself, also as a home brewer, ciders, and you can make quite nice drinks with that. I personally dry hop the cider because I love hops, and you can make great products with that. So if you're interested, contact Jonas. Or send me an email if you want more info about the new products, and even like with the NAB3 or the ciders, I can see if I can come up with a webinar on the subject if you're interested. Just let me know if you complete this form. Just put it in the comments and say, okay, we want a webinar on this or that, and I will make sure we can do this.
I can add, as for the moment we don't have it in stock, the NAB3. It depends on, we are a little bit unsure how the demand will be, but it seems that the interest here are quite high, and then we probably will take it in, have it in stock if the we have enough of interest from your customers. So please let me know. More people asking for it, then we'll keep it in stock as a normal product. Just buy it.
Thanks, Kalle.
Okay, I think we'll keep it in stock. It sounds like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure about which pack sizes are available. Let me see if I can find that out for you.
We have it in 10 kilos now.
Yes.
The one that we take home, but don't have it in stock.
I think that's, but this is by heart. I think that's also the only pack size we have available at the moment.
I think so. Yeah, at least
yeah.
according to the latest information we got. So that's why we are selling.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we have covered all the questions.
Yes.
Johan is typing. Vlad as well.
Thank you, Vlado.
Thank you for listening. And thank you.
Thank you, Johan.
Okay.
So I think we can close then this webinar, and I hope to see you back soon, probably somewhere next week. We still will discuss the subject, and Jonas will invite you via the newsletter and maybe even via social media.
Yeah,
Okay.
depending a little bit where and when. But we can go through that maybe tomorrow, Gino.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, tomorrow afternoon, late afternoon then, if possible for you.
Yeah, Vlado asked where to find the prior presentation webinars. We have gathering them on our website. You can find where we put the links. But you have, when you try to log in, you have to type an email address to be able to see it. Hang on a second.
Yeah, that's true. That's it's just because of this EDU DIP system.
I have to, because it's a bit tricky to find, to be honest. I have to look.
I couldn't find it on your website, to be honest.
No, we don't have any category for it yet. So you have to type the exact address from the beginning. That's why.
Okay.
And also, according to you, Gino, we kept a little bit secret, so to speak. So we communicated
Yes.
to people.
Yes, it was decided I think so it was decided last week that the webinars will stay online for the period of the cycle of the webinars. After that, they will be taken back offline because we hope from early 2021 onwards we can meet in person again, and we will do these webinars at Humlegardens or at another place in Sweden more personally. If you prefer webinars, also let me know in this questionnaire, because to my opinion it works quite well, and it can be a nice addition to
yeah, I think because Sweden is a quite big country, and
yes.
not all have the possibilities to do a physical visit. So even when we have passed this pandemic, I think it's a good idea to have in both ways.
Yeah, I agree. Well, it's a little bit depending on what the bosses at Fermentis decided.
When did we start? It was in May we had the first webinar, wasn't it?
Yes. May or June. I can find out for you.
I know I have the address in an old newsletter, but so I'm trying to find it.
I can also check. No, I cannot find it. Sorry.
Neither do I. Not fast, at least. I know it should be here somewhere, but it's so many documents to toggle through.
Yeah, Vlado has a good idea. You can send it via mail later on.
I'll mail you later on, Lado. No worries.
Okay. Well, thanks, guys. I wish you a great
Okay.
weekend. We are getting great weather. I hope you get the same weather in Sweden the coming weekend and week, so we can enjoy a little bit a nice Indian summer.
Yeah.
And I hope to see you.
It's getting colder.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, here
Now it's nice, but it's not warm anymore. I think we had 15 degrees here, something like that.
oh, really? Oh, no, here it's still 21 plus, and
Mm.
next week they think it will be 28. So nice summer temperatures. Yeah, but only for 1 week. Then we also get rain again, and it will be colder. But the coming week looks fantastic.
Lucky you.
Yes. Okay, guys. See you
Okay.
next time.
Thanks a lot.
And
Take care.
thanks again. Bye bye.